The film opens with a gallery curator named Susan living in an opulent mansion overlooking the glittering lights of Los Angeles, surrounded by wealth and luxury, yet feeling profoundly disconnected from her existence. She receives a manuscript from Edward, her former husband whom she hasn't spoken to in 19 years, a novel titled Nocturnal Animals dedicated to her. The gesture stirs something in her empty life as she begins reading, while her current husband Hutton leaves for New York on business, though she suspects his true intentions involve another woman. The narrative unfolds through 3 interwoven layers, where Susan's present reality collides with memories of her past relationship with Edward and the harrowing fictional story he has written. As Susan delves into the manuscript, the story introduces Tony driving through the desolate highways of West Texas late at night with his wife Laura and teenage daughter India. The family encounters aggressive drivers who force them off the road after India makes an inappropriate gesture at them. 3 menacing men emerge from the other vehicle, and what begins as a tense roadside confrontation escalates when they insist on helping change Tony's flat tire. Tony attempts to maintain politeness and avoid conflict, his passive nature preventing him from asserting control over the increasingly dangerous situation. The men eventually force Laura and India into Tony's car and drive away with them while leaving Tony stranded in an abandoned area with one of the men. Tony hides when the men return, searching for him, eventually making his way to a farmhouse where he contacts authorities. A determined police detective named Bobby arrives to investigate the case and brings Tony back to the location where his family disappeared. The search leads them to a devastating discovery, as both Laura and India are found deceased on a bench, their bodies having endured terrible things before their passing. Bobby reveals through his investigation that Laura's passing was swift while India suffered more, and both experienced assault. The investigation identifies fingerprints belonging to a man named Ray, who had previously been acquitted in a similar case years earlier. Susan becomes so disturbed reading this portion that she pauses to call her own daughter at college just to hear her voice, the fictional story bleeding into her emotional state. A year passes within the manuscript's timeline as Tony struggles with profound guilt over his inability to protect his family that night. Bobby contacts Tony again after apprehending 2 suspects, a man named Turk who was shot during another incident, and Lou, who Tony identifies as one of the perpetrators from that night. Bobby reveals he is suffering from terminal lung cancer with only a year to live, giving him nothing to lose in his pursuit of justice. They locate Ray at a rundown shack and bring him in for questioning, though he denies everything and is eventually released due to insufficient evidence. Bobby, frustrated by bureaucratic obstacles and facing his own mortality, decides to take matters into his own hands and convinces Tony to help him pursue justice outside official channels. Bobby and Tony apprehend Ray again, telling him that Lou has implicated him in the crimes. They bring Lou to the same location, telling him that Ray betrayed him, and the 2 suspects begin arguing with each other, inadvertently confirming their guilt. When Bobby briefly steps away feeling ill, Lou attempts to flee, and Bobby shoots him, permanently stopping his escape. Ray manages to run away into the darkness, and Bobby calmly tells Tony that Ray will need to make it to the highway for any chance of getting away. Tony pursues Ray back to the shack where the incidents originally occurred and finds him sleeping there. Ray wakes and begins taunting Tony with graphic confessions about what happened to Laura and India, testing Tony's resolve. Ray grabs a metal poker while Tony holds Bobby's weapon with trembling hands, and when Ray charges at him, Tony finally shoots him twice. However, Ray manages to strike Tony with the poker before succumbing to his injuries, leaving Tony blinded from the blow. Tony stumbles outside in darkness and accidentally falls on the weapon, causing it to discharge and strike him fatally in the chest, bringing the manuscript story to a tragic conclusion. Throughout reading the novel, Susan experiences flashbacks to her relationship with Edward when they first met in New York after both leaving their native Texas. Edward had been a sensitive, aspiring writer who worked at a bookstore while pursuing his literary dreams, and Susan was drawn to his romantic and creative nature despite her mother's warnings that he lacked the ambition and drive to provide a prosperous life. Susan's mother, a materialistic woman, predicted that Susan would eventually come to resent Edward for his weakness, and that Susan would ultimately become just like her mother, despite her protestations otherwise. After their marriage, Susan grew increasingly critical of Edward's writing, telling him his work wasn't good enough and that writing about himself would never lead to success. Their relationship deteriorated as Susan began an affair with Hutton, the charismatic businessman who would become her second husband. The most devastating betrayal came when Susan became pregnant with Edward's child and chose to terminate the pregnancy without telling him, believing that having a baby would trap her in a life she no longer wanted. Edward discovered Susan and Hutton together in a parking lot outside the medical facility, witnessing the ultimate destruction of his marriage and the loss of his unborn daughter. The parallels between the manuscript and Susan's past become increasingly apparent as she continues reading. Tony's character mirrors Edward's gentle and non-confrontational personality, the same traits that Susan once viewed as weakness. The story of Tony losing his wife and daughter to cruel men on a dark highway reflects how Edward lost his wife and unborn daughter to Susan's choices, both losses occurring in metaphorically dark places. Tony's helplessness in protecting his family parallels Edward's inability to prevent Susan from leaving him and terminating their pregnancy. The revenge Tony seeks against those who destroyed his family represents Edward's own need for closure after the devastation Susan caused in his life. Susan recognizes that Edward has channeled 19 years of pain and anger into creating something powerful, proving wrong her belief that he could never write anything meaningful. Susan finds herself profoundly moved by the manuscript's quality and emotional depth, emailing Edward to tell him she finds his work devastating and brilliant. She suggests they meet while he's in town, and Edward responds simply asking her to name the time and place. By this point, Susan's marriage to Hutton has clearly deteriorated as she overhears him with another woman at a hotel in New York, confirming her suspicions of his infidelity. Her life of material abundance has left her feeling hollow and meaningless, exactly as her mother's life had been, the very thing she swore she would never become. Susan chooses an expensive upscale restaurant for the meeting and dresses in an elegant outfit, clearly hopeful and excited at the prospect of reconnecting with Edward. She arrives early and waits at the table as time passes slowly. More time passes, and Edward still hasn't arrived. Eventually, Susan realizes that Edward isn't coming, that he has deliberately stood her up. The ending reveals Edward's true intention in sending the manuscript was never about reconciliation, but about revenge. Through the novel, he showed Susan the emotional devastation he experienced when she took away his wife and unborn daughter, making her feel the depth of pain her choices caused. By asking her to choose the meeting location and then failing to appear, Edward gives Susan a brief moment of hope and possibility before crushing it completely, leaving her to drown in her empty existence. The fancy restaurant she selected demonstrates to Edward that despite 19 years, Susan remains the materialistic person she became, validating his decision not to meet her. Just as Tony perishes at the end of the manuscript after achieving his revenge, perhaps the part of Edward that still loved Susan also passes away in that moment, finally releasing him from the hold she had on his life. Susan sits alone at the table, understanding that Edward has succeeded without her, that he has become the writer she never believed he could be, and that she is left with nothing but her regrets. The novel, titled Nocturnal Animals, the nickname Edward once called Susan because she stayed awake late into the night, becomes his final communication to her after nearly 2 decades of silence. A devastating artistic statement about betrayal, loss, and the consequences of choosing material security over authentic love.